The gathering storm. The year is 48 BC. Rome, once the beacon of order and civilization, is now on the brink of collapse. A republic forged through centuries of conquest and governance is being torn apart by its own children. At the heart of this destruction stand two titanic figures, Gaius Julius Caesar and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, better known as Pompey the Great. These two men, once allies and pillars of the Roman state, are now locked in a brutal struggle that will decide the fate of the known world. This is not just a civil war. This is a war of ideologies, of ambition, and of survival. Caesar, the military genius who had carved his name into history with his Gallic conquests, now fights not only for power but for his very existence. Pompey, Rome's once greatest general, stands as the last hope for those who believe in the old ways: the Republic, the Senate, the traditions that had made Rome what it was. The Battle of Dyrrhachium would be their first true test, a clash of strategy, will, and fate. The road to war. Before Dyrrhachium, Caesar had already established himself as one of the greatest generals in Roman history. His campaign in Gaul was nothing short of legendary, culminating in the utter defeat of Vercingetorix at Alesia. Yet, his ambition could not be contained. The moment he crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC, Rome's fate was sealed. He declared war not just on Pompey, but on the very system that had governed Rome for centuries. Pompey, despite his reputation as a brilliant general, had spent years in political maneuvering rather than on the battlefield. Though still a formidable force, he had grown cautious, perhaps even hesitant, compared to the bold and decisive Caesar. But his greatest advantage lay not in personal bravery, but in resources: legions of men, a massive navy, and control over Rome's wealth. When the war began, he retreated eastward, consolidating his power in Greece, where he could raise more forces and cut Caesar off from vital supplies. The build-up, strengths and weaknesses. Caesar's march to Dyrrhachium was anything but easy. While he had veterans hardened by years of campaigning, his army was stretched thin. In contrast, Pompey's forces were larger, better supplied, and held the advantage of strategic positioning. However, they were not all veterans. Many were raw recruits who had never seen real combat. Cicero, the famous orator and statesman, lamented that Pompey's army was an unwieldy mix of different cultures and languages, a force that might crumble under the weight of true battle. Caesar's strategy was bold and unconventional. Knowing he was outnumbered, he relied on speed, deception, and psychological warfare. He knew that if he could force Pompey into an engagement on his terms, he could nullify the numerical disadvantage. But before battle could commence, he faced his first true challenge: crossing the Adriatic Sea under the watchful eyes of Pompey's navy. The daring crossing. Caesar's decision to cross the Adriatic in the dead of winter was nothing short of audacious. The Roman calendar had drifted due to lack of proper adjustments, and Caesar, being Pontifex Maximus, knew the real time of year. Pompey's admiral, Bibulus, mistakenly believed it was still winter and had anchored his fleet, thinking no one would be foolish enough to attempt a crossing in such treacherous conditions. But Caesar was no ordinary man. With only half his forces, he set sail, leaving behind his baggage and non-essential personnel. The gamble paid off. By the time Bibulus realized what had happened, Caesar had already landed with 7 legions. Frustrated and desperate, Bibulus retaliated by burning the returning ships, effectively cutting Caesar off from the rest of his forces. It was a reckless move that would come back to haunt Pompey's fleet. The siege of Dyrrhachium begins. With only a portion of his army, Caesar moved swiftly, taking the towns of Oricum and Apollonia. He then marched toward Dyrrhachium, a key supply base for Pompey. If he could capture it, he would force Pompey into a battle on unfavorable terms. But Caesar's trusted officer, Favonius Rufus, betrayed him, revealing his movements to Pompey. Now, the race was on. Could Caesar reach Dyrrhachium first, or would Pompey block his path? Pompey, uncharacteristically decisive, pushed his men to the limits. Despite some of his allies deserting due to exhaustion, he arrived at Dyrrhachium first, setting up fortified positions that would make any assault costly. Caesar, knowing a direct attack was unwise, withdrew to a defensible position south of the Absus River. Here, both generals engaged in a dangerous game of chess, maneuvering, fortifying, and preparing for the inevitable showdown. The stakes of Dyrrhachium. For Pompey, this was his moment to strike. He had the numbers, the supplies, and the defensive advantage. But his own hesitation, his fear of Caesar's veterans, would prove to be his greatest weakness. Caesar, on the other hand, had audacity and experience. He knew that his men, though fewer, were superior in discipline and loyalty. As the two armies settled in, the battle lines were drawn, and the fate of Rome hung in the balance. What followed would be a series of daring strategies, brutal skirmishes, and one of the most dramatic sieges in Roman history. The siege tightens, Caesar's gamble and Pompey's response. As the cold winds of early 48 BC swept across the Adriatic, the Roman world stood at a crossroads. Two of its greatest generals, Gaius Julius Caesar and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, were locked in a struggle not just for dominance, but for the very soul of Rome itself. Caesar, the seasoned warlord who had turned the barbaric lands of Gaul into a Roman province, now found himself outnumbered and isolated in Greece. Pompey, the once great conqueror of the East, commanded a massive yet unwieldy army, a force that was as much a liability as it was an advantage. With the city of Dyrrhachium at the center of their confrontation, each man sought to outmaneuver the other in a chess game where the stakes were nothing less than the future of the Republic. Caesar's trap, the art of siege warfare. Caesar knew that his enemy had superior numbers, but numbers alone did not win war, strategy did. Recognizing that Pompey relied heavily on supply lines supported by his naval supremacy, Caesar devised a bold strategy, a complete encirclement of Pompey's forces. Using the rugged terrain to his advantage, he instructed his men to construct an elaborate network of trenches, wooden palisades, and defensive outposts that would surround Pompey's camp. If he could cut off his opponent from his food and water sources, he could force Pompey to fight on his terms or surrender without a battle. This was not an easy task. The fortifications stretched for miles, requiring constant labor under enemy fire. But Caesar's legions were hardened veterans, accustomed to war's brutal realities. Each soldier understood the significance of the work. They were not merely digging trenches, they were building victory. Pompey's dilemma, the price of inaction. Pompey, ever the cautious general, watched these developments with concern. His instincts told him that engaging Caesar's battle-hardened legions in direct combat was too risky. He had the advantage in numbers, yes, but his army was largely made up of recruits and foreign auxiliaries. Many of them had never faced the relentless discipline of Caesar's veterans. Instead of launching an all-out assault to stop the encirclement, Pompey chose to fortify his own positions and wait Caesar out. It was a decision that historians would debate for centuries. By failing to act decisively, Pompey allowed Caesar's trap to take shape. But Pompey was not entirely idle. He used his superior cavalry to harass Caesar's supply lines and launch occasional raids against the siege works. Yet these actions did little to halt the inevitable tightening of the noose around his neck. Skirmishes in the shadow of Dyrrhachium. As the siege dragged on, both sides engaged in a series of intense skirmishes. Pompey's men attempted multiple breakouts, only to be repelled by Caesar's relentless counterattacks. One particularly brutal encounter saw Caesar's 9th Legion ambushed while constructing an outpost. Surrounded and under a hail of enemy missiles, the legion held firm until reinforcements arrived. Caesar, witnessing the chaos firsthand, personally led a countercharge, rallying his men and driving the Pompeians back. Despite these victories, Caesar faced a dire situation. His men were low on supplies, and morale was beginning to fray. His gamble had yet to pay off, and Pompey still held the advantage of the sea. Then, in a sudden twist of fate, the balance of power shifted. The turning point, Pompey's counteroffensive. Pompey's scouts, having studied Caesar's fortifications, discovered a critical weakness. A section of the siege works near the coast was incomplete. With this knowledge, Pompey formulated a bold plan to break the siege. Under the cover of darkness, he mobilized 30,000 men for a multi-pronged assault. His goal was simple: punch through Caesar's lines, reunite with his supply routes, and shatter the encirclement. As dawn broke, a massive assault began. Thousands of legionaries stormed the trenches, overwhelming the outnumbered defenders. Pompey's cavalry landed behind enemy lines, cutting off Caesar's reinforcements. Archers and slingers rained missiles upon the besiegers, forcing them into retreat. For the first time in the campaign, Caesar's men were breaking. Chaos engulfed the battlefield as Roman fought Roman in a desperate struggle for survival. At the critical moment, Caesar himself rushed to the front lines. He grabbed fleeing soldiers, shook them violently, and shouted, "Do you think this is Gergovia? Will you let Pompey take your victory from you?" Despite his presence, the day was lost. Pompey had smashed through the encirclement and re-established his supply lines. Caesar, seeing the inevitable, ordered a tactical retreat. The aftermath, the road to Pharsalus. For the first time in the civil war, Caesar had suffered a major defeat. He had lost thousands of men, and his plan to starve out Pompey had failed. Worse, his army was now vulnerable, cut off from reinforcements, weakened, and in dire need of supplies. Pompey's forces, meanwhile, celebrated their victory. Yet Pompey made a fateful error. He did not pursue Caesar. He believed the war was as good as won and allowed Caesar to escape. Little did he know, this moment would come back to haunt him. For though Caesar had lost the Battle of Dyrrhachium, he had not lost the war. He would regroup, strategize, and prepare for his ultimate showdown with Pompey at Pharsalus, where the fate of Rome would be decided. The road to Pharsalus, Caesar's last stand, or Pompey's greatest mistake. The dust had barely settled on the blood-stained fields of Dyrrhachium when the realization set in: Caesar had been defeated. His forces, so often invincible, had been outmaneuvered, outgunned, and forced into retreat. The mighty general, who had conquered Gaul and stared down the Senate, now found himself on the back foot for the first time in his career. And yet, Pompey, standing on the edge of absolute victory, hesitated. In that hesitation, Caesar saw his chance. A dangerous retreat. Caesar's army on the brink. Pompey's counteroffensive had shattered the siege lines, forcing Caesar's legions to retreat inland. His men, exhausted and demoralized, marched without food, without rest, and with the bitter sting of defeat hanging over them. But this was still Caesar's army. Even in their lowest moments, they were trained for endurance. These were the same men who had crossed the Rubicon, who had stormed the beaches of Britannia, who had carved their way through the frozen Alps of Gaul. They would not crumble, not yet. Caesar, ever the master of psychological warfare, did not let the loss define them. Instead, he spun the narrative to his advantage, reminding his soldiers that even the greatest commander suffered setbacks. Did Alexander not face defeats? Did Hannibal not retreat before striking his fatal blow? We have lost a battle, but the war is far from over. Despite the speech, the reality remained grim. Thousands of his men were dead or captured. His supply lines were cut off. Pompey's forces, now emboldened, had the strategic advantage. But Pompey, for all his brilliance, was still a man trapped in the politics of the Republic. He had won the battle, but now he had to decide what to do next. Pompey's fatal mistake, the arrogance of victory. To any rational strategist, this was the moment to strike. Caesar's army was limping through Greece, vulnerable, and on the edge of collapse. A well-timed pursuit could have ended the war within weeks. Pompey's generals, including the veteran Titus Labienus, begged him to press the attack. Drive them into the sea. My lord, do not let them breathe. If we strike now, Caesar will be finished. But Pompey hesitated. Why? Because deep down, Pompey still saw himself as the defender of republican values. Unlike Caesar, who had no qualms about absolute power, Pompey still played by the old rules. He did not want a battle of annihilation. He wanted to surrender. He feared that destroying Caesar's army outright would make him look like a tyrant. He assumed that Caesar, now broken, would sue for peace. But Caesar never surrendered, and so, Pompey let him go. Historians debate whether this was an act of mercy, arrogance, or simply a fundamental misunderstanding of who Caesar truly was. Regardless of the reason, it would prove to be the greatest mistake of his career. The rebirth of Caesar's army. Rallying at Thessaly. With Pompey failing to give chase, Caesar did what he did best: adapt. He led his battered army southward, eventually reaching Thessaly. There, he found a small Roman garrison still loyal to him. This was the lifeline he needed. He immediately set about replenishing supplies from local allies, reorganizing his legions, absorbing scattered survivors into new formations, recruiting reinforcements. Though limited, they were enough to rebuild his strength. Meanwhile, Pompey's army, now over 60,000 strong, was moving slowly. The Senate, eager for a spectacle rather than a swift victory, demanded that Pompey drag the war out to fully humiliate Caesar. This delay gave Caesar time to prepare. By the time Pompey finally arrived in Thessaly, Caesar was ready. The stage was set for Pharsalus, the most famous battle of the Roman Civil War, the battlefield of destiny. Choosing Pharsalus, Caesar's forces were still outnumbered, his 30,000 men against Pompey's 60,000. But numbers had never mattered to Caesar. He had fought against overwhelming odds before, and each time, he had turned the impossible into victory. He knew that Pompey's greatest weakness was his overconfidence, and he planned to exploit it. Pharsalus was the perfect battlefield. It was flat and open, ideal for Pompey's larger cavalry force but also perfect for ambushes. It forced both armies into a decisive confrontation Pompey would have to commit. It gave Caesar the opportunity to bait his enemy into making a fatal mistake. And so, with the sun rising over the fields of Thessaly, the two greatest generals of Rome prepared for their final showdown. The night before the battle, the calm before the storm. That night, both camps were filled with anticipation. In Pompey's camp, there was an air of certainty. His men believed that victory was inevitable. Senators and aristocrats had already begun discussing how to divide Caesar's wealth after the battle. Some even hosted feasts, convinced that the war was won. In Caesar's camp, there was determination, but also quiet tension. His men knew the odds were against them, but they also trusted their general. Caesar himself, rather than sleeping, walked among the ranks, speaking to his soldiers personally. Tomorrow, we fight not just for Rome, but for our survival. If we lose everything. But if we win, Rome is ours. His veterans gripped their swords tighter. They would not break. As the first light of dawn crept over the battlefield, the armies of Caesar and Pompey stood face to face for the final time. The battle that would change Rome forever was about to begin. The Battle of Pharsalus, the day Rome changed forever. The morning sun rose over the plains of Pharsalus, casting long shadows over two colossal armies that now stood face to face. This was not just another battle, this was the confrontation that would decide the fate of the Roman Republic. On one side stood Pompey Magnus, the Senate's chosen defender, commanding an army twice the size of his opponents. He had the superior numbers, the backing of the aristocracy, and the prestige of a lifetime of victories. The Republic had placed its faith in him to crush the rebellion once and for all. On the other side was Gaius Julius Caesar, the veteran warlord who had defied tradition, crossed the Rubicon, and dared to challenge the Senate's authority. His men were fewer in number, battered from retreat, but hardened by years of warfare. They were not just fighting for victory, they were fighting for survival. Both generals knew that Pharsalus was the endgame. There would be no retreat, no more negotiations. One of them would leave this battlefield as the master of Rome. The other would leave in disgrace or not at all. The armies take their positions. Pompey deployed his army with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. His 60,000 infantry were arranged in a traditional Roman triplex acies, 3 lines of heavy infantry, forming an iron wall that could crush anything in its path. His 7,000 cavalry, the largest force of horsemen ever assembled in a Roman civil war, were placed on his left flank, ready to overwhelm and flank Caesar's army. Pompey's plan was simple: use his cavalry to outflank Caesar's right wing and crush them from the side. Once Caesar's flank collapsed, his cavalry would circle behind and attack from the rear. His infantry, superior in numbers, would then grind down what remained of Caesar's forces. It was a textbook strategy, one that had worked time and time again. But Caesar had seen this before. He studied Pompey's formations, recognizing the flaw in his strategy. If Pompey placed all his faith in cavalry superiority, then Caesar would need to find a way to neutralize it. Caesar's counter-strategy, a masterstroke of war. Caesar arranged his 30,000 legionaries, a standard 3-line formation, but with one crucial modification. Behind his right flank, where Pompey's cavalry was expected to attack, he concealed a 4th line, a special reserve force of 3,000 of his best infantry. These men were given one task only: wait, hold the line, and when the time comes, strike at the cavalry. It was an unorthodox move. Infantry were never used to counter cavalry in open battle, but Caesar knew that Pompey's cavalry, despite their numbers, were not elite horsemen. They were mostly young aristocrats, eager for glory, but inexperienced in real combat. If they were engaged in close quarters fighting, they would panic. With his trap set, Caesar gave the signal. The Battle of Pharsalus had begun. The clash, Rome's fate decided in blood. Pompey's legions stood still. He had ordered his men not to charge. He wanted Caesar's troops to exhaust themselves by running across the battlefield first. But Caesar's men, seeing the hesitation, stopped halfway. They took a breath, reformed their ranks, and then charged at full force. The front lines slammed into each other, shields clashing, swords hacking. The battlefield became a chaotic storm of blood and dust. Then, Pompey's cavalry charged. 7,000 horsemen raced forward, aiming to crush Caesar's right flank as planned. The young Roman nobles, eager to prove themselves, screamed battle cries as they rode. But just as they reached Caesar's right wing, the trap was sprung. Caesar's hidden 4th line of infantry emerged from behind the ranks. The legionaries threw their javelins directly into the onrushing cavalry. then drew their swords and charged. Pompey's cavalry panicked. These were not seasoned horsemen. They had never been trained for sustained hand-to-hand combat against infantry. Within minutes, the cavalry began to break. Some tried to retreat, but they had nowhere to go. The left flank of Pompey's entire strategy collapsed, and Caesar was not done yet. The final blow, Caesar's counterattack. As Pompey's cavalry routed from the field, Caesar ordered his men to swing around and attack Pompey's infantry from the side. Pompey, seeing his battle plan unravel, watched in horror. He had expected his cavalry to crush Caesar's flank. Instead, it was his own men who were being surrounded. Caesar, sensing the moment of victory, personally led his reserves in a final charge. His men roared in unison as they surged forward. Pompey's lines buckled, then they broke. One by one, Pompey's men threw down their weapons and fled. The battlefield, once a sea of organized formations, became a massacre. Pompey's fall, the death of the Republic. Pompey himself did not stay to fight. As his army crumbled, he turned his horse and rode off the battlefield. The great general, the champion of the Senate, was now fugitive. Caesar's men pursued the remnants of Pompey's army, but their general ordered them to stop. "Spare the Romans," he commanded. It was over. Caesar had won. The Battle of Pharsalus was not just a military victory, it was the moment the Republic truly died. With Pompey defeated, there was no force left in Rome that could oppose Caesar's rule. Aftermath. The fate of Pompey and Caesar's rise. Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping to seek refuge with Pharaoh Ptolemy XIII. But as he arrived on the shores of Alexandria, he was betrayed. The Egyptians, eager to please Caesar, murdered Pompey on the beach and sent his severed head to Caesar as a gift. When Caesar arrived in Egypt and was presented with Pompey's head, he did not rejoice. Instead, he wept. This was a great man. He deserved better. But it was too late. The war was over. Rome was now Caesar's. The legacy of Pharsalus, the dawn of empire. The Battle of Pharsalus was more than just a clash of armies. It was a turning point in world history. It marked the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of Caesar's absolute rule. It demonstrated Caesar's genius as a tactician, securing his place as one of history's greatest commanders. It showed that the old ways of the Senate were finished. Rome would never be the same again. In the coming years, Caesar would be named dictator for life, only to be assassinated by those who feared his power. But his victory at Pharsalus had set Rome on a course that could not be undone. Rome would no longer be ruled by senators squabbling in the forum. It would be ruled by emperors. And it all started on the fields of Pharsalus, the war that changed the world. The Roman Civil War was not just a power struggle between two men, it was a revolution. It shattered the ideals of the Republic and paved the way for the Roman Empire. Pompey had the numbers. He had the Senate. He had the chance to win. But Caesar had the mind of a genius, the loyalty of his men, and the courage to take risks no one else dared to take. In the end, that made all the difference.